Are we good to go?
I think let's just let a few people in the room.
Yeah.
Now, are those real bird sounds or is it just some?
It's actually real bird sounds outside my window, yeah. Nice, Nat. It's a
Very
welcome
nice.
relief from the Hadidas.
Yeah.
I think you can go ahead, Caryn.
Welcome everyone to our second session for the day, where as a School of Governance, we're part of the South African hub of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, which is a series of conversations and engagements happening all across the world, from the 13th to the 16th, thinking about how government can do government differently. And we're really happy to be part of that kind of growing movement. This morning we had a session thinking about how we measure successes as a state, thinking about how the state can do things differently within a kind of bureaucratic architecture, how we can build these co-produced ways of doing things between the state and academia or community. And this conversation really builds on that one by asking a similar question when it comes to grassroots community and its relationship to government. So just a little bit about the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. It really is there to build a strong public sector and, as they say in the manifesto, unleashing a hidden and untapped, unleashing the hidden and untapped potential within public administrations, offering a platform for public servants who are doing really innovative and engaging things with society. So it really is, part of a festival that is aimed at the civil service. However, part of this is about the public sector's engagement outside itself with civil society, with academia. And this particular session, we want to talk about civil society and the potential that is there to partner with the state to make an impact and have mutually beneficial relationships. So sometimes the relationship between NGOs or civil society and the state is cast as adversarial, and sometimes with good reason, with NGOs and grassroots organization playing an important role of stepping in where there are failures of the state. But in this session, we want to look at the potential for those engagements that are mutually beneficial, convivial, productive, generative, where civil society can partner with the state in addressing some of society's challenge. But we also want to ask really critical questions about how that is possible, why it's not possible more, what about the kind of moment in civil society right now is necessary in civil society for these relationships also to be built on. I think the session, one of the outcomes of the morning session was that where there are really good relationships between state and non-state actors, the state comes in to support existing projects or existing initiatives, and it's a conversation. And so my conversation is with the executive director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, a well-known civil society activist and also former public servant, an activist from the public service. Neeshan Bolton is the executive director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. since its inception in 2008. He's been a community and political activist for the past 35 years, with involvement ranging from teacher unionism, civic organizing, youth activism, and formal and underground ANC activism. He was an activist in the Transvaal Indian Congress and the United Democratic Front. He currently chairs the boards of Sanka and Nishtara Lenasia, and he'll tell you about that. He's previously worked in the government sector, and he's been the chairperson on the board of directors at the Matthew Guniwe School of Leadership and Governance, and on the board of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. He has a background in public finance and administration, and is also a Witsi from back in the day. And so with that, let me warmly welcome you, Sean Bolton, to this conversation today.
Thanks, Caryn, and greetings to everybody.
Thank you so much. So even though there's a few people on the actual call, so we welcome Dimoketso, Kwezi, Lucia, and Moses. There are others that are joining us on Facebook Live and our YouTube channel. So welcome to you too, and welcome to those who will be joining us not live, but will tap into this conversation. So Sean, you know, and panelists, sorry, not panelists, and participants, as a lead up to these conversations, we put out feelers to look for things that we weren't aware of, these productive, engaging relationships with the state. And we asked people to contact us, to email in, to tell us about these. But we didn't get any feedback from anyone. You will have as we talked about in the earlier session, you'll have a different take on why people might not have spoken out. But these initiatives do exist. You know, let's start off the conversation there. Why is it you think that we didn't find any kind of uptake of our invitation?
Look, there are two or three things. I think one, if I'm running some NGO somewhere and I don't know how the communication was sent out, firstly, whether you just put it on your own social media platforms, or whether there was a direct email to specific organizations. But I think many would look at you as the Wits School of Governance and say, well, this is an academic institution and you want me to now write something to you that you will evaluate academically. So I think the medium of communication is perhaps needed to be relooked at. And secondly, the databases of organizations with whom government has a current working partnership, whether it's in education, social welfare, health, local government, policing. There are hundreds of these kinds of public partnerships that are out there. And there would have been different communication channels to many of them. But I suppose it's a combination of those two, plus is the lack of awareness of the call that was made in the first instance.
So we definitely have taken a page out of the NGO book to how to engage with NGOs for these events in the future. So thanks for that. But let's begin our conversation on the topic for today, which is around bridging the divide, civil society, either as a kind of body or entity that kind of fills in the gaps left by the state, or is it a necessary part of society that the state needs to be engaging with more? Your thoughts?
Well, I think it depends on the objectives of the two. If they both share the same kinds of developmental objectives, then there would always be a necessity to collaborate. However, there might well be sections of civil society who think that the state must be dismantled or must be done away with. And obviously for them, there would be no basis for collaboration. But there might also be people within the state who think that they don't need the necessary meddling and inconvenience of trying to work with civil society because it's not one homogeneous group. They don't have one set of ideas on any given issue. And sometimes it's just hard work trying to reach consensus on any specific issue when you work with multiple stakeholders, particularly from those who are outside of government. So finding that kind of balance, the points for collaboration, the commonality, the shared visions, and all of that, I think, is linked to issues of trust, issues of common visions. And I say this because we are in a climate today where there is, and you've seen this from the Gauteng City Region Observatory study, the level of trust in government has just fallen dramatically, not only here, but I think across the globe. Now, when there is that level of mistrust, then trying to figure out how to collaborate, there will always be suspicion about whether you've been co-opted or whether there is genuine interest in wanting to achieve a common objective. So it's trust building that I suppose is the starting point for any collaboration that you would want to work towards, rather than just inviting people to an initiative and assuming that they will share your vision or the outcomes that you're working towards.
So if trust building is the kind of starting point, are there actually these kinds of generative relationships between the state and civil society, in which there may or may not have been trust, but it's working?
I'm sure they are, and I'm sure they were driven by necessity. If there's a crisis in a particular area around a given issue, then out of necessity, people have to collaborate. But I'm not sure if that is a partnership or whether it's a sustainable partnership. Let me give you an example. In 1995, we had the situation out in Lenasia Extension 13. This was one of the last housing projects of the old House of Delegates. They had completed it in about 92, 93. They had never allocated the homes. 94 elections comes and goes. We go into the first local government elections, and this newly established housing department is still trying to figure out how best to allocate these homes. And those homes then get occupied illegally. And the then MEC of the time, Den Mofokeng, is at a loss on how to deal with this, because the people who had invaded the homes come from an area outside of Lenasia, and he has this quandary. How do you allocate these homes? Who best to do it? His own administration was an amalgamation of the Transvaal Provincial Administration, the House of Delegates, House of Administration, and the newly established government itself. And in that context, you had ward and community development forums as a major part of the RDP program, and eventually then turned to ourselves as community activists. And what do? We then call up a huge public meeting to get a mandate to engage with government and to elect a body of people who will then work with it to firstly deal with the issue of illegal occupation, and thereafter to allocate the homes on a new non-racial criteria. And for the first time, you actually have a group of community-based activists, administrators or officials from government who work through thousands of applications. And the beauty of this is in the process, they uncover, because they know the area, they know people, they are able to uncover many who didn't qualify for those homes. Or where there were suspicions, they were able to pick up the phones and weed out a whole range of people who were on the list, but who were not deserving to be there. And in about a year, that joint structure allocated the homes that needed to be allocated. But the necessity no longer existed for the ongoing collaboration. Government then reverts to its normal routine of trying to allocate homes and land. And immediately thereafter, you have large-scale allegations of corruption on waiting lists and allocations of land up until today. So that kind of a model, which could have been embedded within the way that a new government was meant to work, was done away when the crisis no longer existed. And that's what I'm saying. It's always situational. It always depends on leadership at the time, and whether there are points of commonality around objectives and vision.
So does it mean, and I hesitate to put a cynical spin on this, positive week, but does it mean that if we don't have anyone in the state to, or leadership to kind of open the conversation for that relationship, that it will never happen?
No, I wouldn't go that far, but I think it just becomes incredibly difficult to get it off the block, to get it started. I chair another NGO, Neeshan. This is a community-based drug rehab center. For many years, self-funding. And at some point, the provincial government developed a strategy that it could not do drug rehabilitation work as government, but needed to work with organizations who had that kind of expertise. And that resides in Senka and all of its affiliates, and Neeshan is one of them. And through a partnership that is regulated by, a comprehensive agreement, a service level agreement that has all the inputs and outputs and deliverables that you will find in any government department, being done by people who are not trained public servants, but who know the work of drug rehab administration. And it's a partnership that works. It's a partnership that delivers. But it's also a partnership that could change tomorrow if there is a new policy that says government must now set up its own rehab facilities and doesn't need to collaborate with institutions like Neeshan or others. So it depends on the policy direction. It depends on leadership, and then it depends on people on the ground who are able to give life and effect to an idea of a partnership. And this idea of this partnership has now spread to, I think, many other institutions and has become a model for the Department of Social Development in Gauteng to work with different facilities. And I think it has enabled them to at least offer a service that government on its own would not have been able to do.
So that's within the kind of health space, right? Or the social development. And, just reflecting on this morning session, even one of the good hood stories in KZN was providing a safe space for people who are, involved with substance abuse. And it's a kind of rehab center. But do you think a similar model can be kind of transplanted, not within the health space? So this morning there were suggestions of the education space, these kinds of working relationships that the state needs and civil society needs, because it's a relationship that's not only mutually beneficial, but also takes care of the lack of capacity within each of those entities to meet all of the needs that it needs to have met.
Yeah, I think there's scope for collaboration, partnerships in almost every area of work that government does. Where the complexities come is when there are tenders or contracts that have to be regulated. That for me has become, I think, the biggest difficulty for many entities. Where it's clear-cut service provision, I think that those are more easier to regulate and to administer from the side of government. I think if you look at policing work, policing forums, in some areas they work exceptionally well. And that's because you have a good station commander, you have good community leaders, and they know where the boundary lines are between the work that each has to do. And they also have the mechanisms to deal with misunderstandings or conflict. Because when those don't exist, you have found in many areas where community policing forums virtually take over police stations and want to then determine who gets employed at the police station, who gets the contracts at police stations. You've seen similar kinds of there are good school governing bodies that do incredible work, but there are also school governing bodies who want to appoint staff, who want to appoint the textbook provider, who want to appoint the person who's doing the landscaping or gardening or painting and so forth. And if teachers, principals who have not been trained to manage these kinds of contractual issues now have to start dealing with it, many of them just give in to an overextension of the work of non-governmental entities. Because if you look at the training of civil servants, whether they're teachers, they police station heads, or any government entity, I doubt in any of their training are these community relationship aspects that they are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Community mediation issues are not there. Organizing communities for a particular objective, if you are leading a government entity, it is not part of the work of the training of public servants. I doubt it. And then they learn by instinct, they execute by instinct. In some cases they succeed, in many cases they don't, and people get frustrated and they leave. Because communities, likewise, I think there's an issue of understanding their boundaries, and sometimes out of sheer frustration, people want to actually take over institutions of government and think that they can deliver the services more effectively. And that might have been proven in municipalities that you've seen these kinds of initiatives where people have started delivering services themselves, fixing up roads themselves by withholding fees. So those models are beginning to emerge. Whether they will be sustainable and whether they are progressive in the long term, we'll have to we'll have to wait and see.
Sure. So, if you were saying some of that kind of training of, say, within for principals or within policing institutions of the state, some of that training doesn't exist. So civil society has had to, but also sometimes overreaching their mandate to step in. But is it government's kind of mandate to do that, or does it require the partnership, or is it just about kind of lack of capacity on public servants' side?
Well, if you come from the generation that I do, that believed in notion of people's power through a people's government, then the people-centeredness of government would require it to be able to work with people in its widest range of complexity. So even if you are meant to be heading up an institution, it requires more than the technical skills of running a police station. but it's actually the skills of how do you work with communities? How do you build circles of relationships? How do you build coalitions around particular things? And as I said, that might or might not be part of the training that public servants go through. I have been too long out of the public service to know what the training syllabus is. But even for those who come through university training and become public servants, I'm not too sure whether that kind of stuff is there. As I said to you, if you look at places like Harvard and a number of others, they have embedded causes around social justice work, social justice organizing, and you use those core sets of skills in whichever area of work you do as a public servant.
So if you just if you can see the chat there, Shan, there's a comment from one of our participants, Timakatso Babi, and I'll read this for people who are watching on Facebook and YouTube Live. Government personnel employed in certain portfolios are hesitant to partner with or collaborate with civil society and NGOs, and would rather steal programs that civil society organizations present to them, as rather than seeking partnership. Most of the time, government employees defraud the state using business or project plans that are stolen from civil society, who innocently submit their proposals pleading for collaboration because they are on the ground and understand the core issues of that particular community. In bridging the gap, civil society organizations need to lend the project and programs, need to lead the project and programs in their own communities. What's your comment to that?
Look, I think corruption is perhaps the biggest issue aside from unemployment in this country today. And this, again, the City Region Observatory study confirms that. Perceptions of corruption are just huge. I wouldn't say that this is prevalent or is something that I would describe to every public servant. For me, it's a miracle that the water still flows in many homes in this province. The electricity is still on in many homes in this province. So there are things that are functioning because there are dedicated public servants or civil servants across the length and breadth of government. They might be diminishing in number, but I think there are many. So I wouldn't want to put it to all of them. But it's the issue of leadership. If the leadership of an institution doesn't inculcate that kind of culture of building partnerships with communities, doesn't create the environment for the building of those kinds of partnerships, then as a civil servant down the line, you're not going to be wanting to do that because you have, I mean, I know government has your annual performance plan has 101 deliverables, and every day you have to tick off what you're going to accomplish in relation to that APP. Now, in the APP, community building coalitions, community consultation, and what have you, it just doesn't feature because it's not a tangible thing to measure. Sometimes also it delays projects, and the last thing you want on your annual performance rating is to indicate these kinds of delays. So the way in which performance is measured doesn't really allow for the greatest building of partnerships with communities or community structures. You'll do it when it suits a particular outcome that you need to achieve within a particular time frame. So you would need to look at government as a whole, its rules, its regulations, the leadership, the bureaucracy, but ultimately the performance management systems as well. I don't think allow for this. I think it is true that there are many who, let me give you another example. In the period that I was in local government, there was a wonderful civic center out in Lenasia South. And we experimented with a model that said, let's create a community-based entity that will run the civic center. So it would lease it out. It would pump back, so it's a non-profit entity. It would pump back all of the revenue generated into the maintenance of the facility. And for a year or more, it was a huge success. But obviously, it now meant that, all of the provision of services, the procurement of toilet rolls, everything else was now done by a community-based entity. And thereafter, that was withdrawn. Today, that facility is in a derelict state. And that's because the opportunities that people thought would be there for out of control, you then begin to look at opportunities for other kinds of enrichment, or even just because you don't trust that communities will run an institution better than you think you can. It is now, it was withdrawn. And again, another very positive partnership that could have yielded better results for the people within that area, I think was lost.
I mean, are these only possible, do you think, at these kind of these localized case-by-case opportunities where there's a willingness by, say, a regional or district leader or ward council or whatever it is, and willingness by a community organization? Are there no opportunities to kind of scale this up, to think through how co-producing or co-managing local facilities could work across space?
So I serve on the board of the South African Forestries Company. One of the beauty of this is that SAFCOL runs forests now of land that has been claimed back by many communities. So these communities are now being transferred the land back to them. What it has done, it has changed the power relations. So SAFCOL as a state-owned entity now has to almost negotiate each usage of those forests with communities, and would have to now, because communities can go to SAPI, they can go to Mondi, they can go to SAF, so they have a range of options that they can now go to. And therefore, we have a responsibility to make the best offering to them and to stick to the terms and conditions of those agreements and give them the returns that they want. So these kinds of partnerships are possible in all different spheres of government, whether it's in marine work, the fisheries, whether it's in our water works. It depends on the power relations. It does depend on leadership. It does depend on whether the bureaucracy thinks that engaging with communities is worth their time and structuring that engagement.
So unless we structure the engagement, unless we, put our planning where our mouth is about this idea of a social compact, or design plans of actually building working relationships with civil society and actually supporting those structures that do exist. Unless we do that, do you think this idea of a social compact is actually just pie in the sky?
I struggle to understand how social compacts get done. I still need to understand more about it, because when we think of social compacts, just across the entire country, the issues in this country are too diversified. Struggles are very localized. The organizations are also dispersed across every community and every issue. And if you accept that as a reality, then the social compacts need to be built up around issues and where they exist from a local to a national level. But they also need to be localized where it is necessary. So if you take the kind of Ahmadiba Crisis Committee and the fights that's going on in the Transkei, I'm not sure if a national social compact addresses that issue, or whether it's something that must be specific to that particular community and dealing with its interests and needs. Now, there might well be an argument that what the local need impedes a national imperative or need, but that becomes part of that kind of negotiations process. I think just vague social compacts that don't have local specifics, I think could just be meaningless.
Mm. You know, in closing, you know, part of the creative bureaucracy, you know, movement and festival seeks to kind of look beyond the kind of critical, you know, tendency of evaluating government and governance. But I think in this particular moment and this conversation, it's important within this particular time to think about if we are to build such a framework for partnerships, given the work that civil society currently is doing through your organization and partnerships around your organization around defending our democracy, you know, there's not really an incentive for the state to support such initiatives, because those initiatives are actually shining a light on state corruption and the kind of failures of the state. So how do we get that balance right? So on the one hand, we want to build these partnerships and these productive relationships. On the other hand, we don't want to empower it too much, because it can tear down some of the gains or the, you know, whatever, the achievements of the state.
As I said, if there's a commonality of objectives and a commonality of vision, then and if at the end of the day it improves the lives of people on the whole, then that contestation shouldn't exist. So if you take a place like Kerala, here you have a government, or used to, you know, again, it's something I haven't looked at in the last 10 years, but they would have the equivalent of what we have as our IDPs. But Kerala doesn't just do the IDP. They deploy 30,000 retired engineers to work with every community on the project that they would have identified to help them execute it. And who gets the credit at the end of the day? It would be the state, but the major beneficiaries would be people. So I think that it's that kind of narrowness of vision that would prevent these effective partnerships from in fact emerging. I'm not blind to the fact that working with civil society or community-based organizations is incredibly hard. But in all of its complexity, I think at the end of the day, just about every community-based organization, civil society organizations, they want basic improvements in life for people, whether it's at a local, provincial, or national level. And when you start off on identifying the commonalities, I think the rest of it would be much more easier to build the partnerships around. But if a partnership is built on, we need this at this particular point in time, and therefore we want you to come in to almost rubber stamp something, then it's not a partnership. It's a co-option, and it's doomed to failure.
I struggle to think that there'll be better closing statements than that. But in the previous session, we tried to close on what are the kinds of the sets of values that need to exist in a civil society and the state to enable these kinds of partnerships to be built in the first instance and to be supported in the second.
So two things. One, let me just give you, there's this wonderful book called Reinventing Government. I forget who the authors were. And one of the key values now is innovation that I think must be brought in. So you have a situation in the US at the time, I'm not sure, I think it was Al Gore was deputy president. And what they find is that pigs have this wonderful ability to smell out drugs. And they experiment using pigs at the airport. And somebody says, but the regulation says we can only use dogs. And that could have killed the initiative. But some smart bureaucrat then says, okay, we will now reclassify all pigs to be dogs in the vicinity of this airport. Now, if you take that with what's happening in Tshwane at the moment, some poor chap plants cabbages outside of his home in where you would normally have lawn. The city officials are saying that you can only plant lawn. And he's saying, well, your category of lawn is wrong. Why can't it include cabbages? So it's about innovation, and it's about identifying what needs to be done to make things better. But I think ultimately it's about trust and altruism as core ingredients for any partnership between government and those outside of it.
Thank you, Shan. I think, lots of the things that you said really dovetails so well with what was mentioned in the session this morning, around, just those simple values, and the kind of courage it would take to challenge sometimes our red tape, the red tape that exists. I want to thank you for being part of this, for rearranging your schedule to make time for us, and we are supporters, but also real admirers of the work of the foundation and yourself, and we hope that you find in the School of Governance a kind of willing partner to engage in these kinds of issues. Thank you so much for your time. And any closing words from you?
Thank you. Thanks to Lerato, and more so thanks to her for putting up a very flattering photograph of myself. So I'm just grateful for the opportunity. But I do think that the School of Governance must look at other models in other parts of the world for issues of governance to move beyond the public service.
Thank you. And that's a conversation for another day. Thanks so much, Shan. Thank you for those who join us on the call today, who are joining us on our social media platforms. We look forward to engaging with you further. These are only the starts. It's only the start of conversations around how, as a state, the civil society and research organizations, we can build relationships and build the kinds of, rebuild the trust deficit, if it were, that exists, so that we can get the job done in innovative ways. And so I'll encourage you, as we did this morning, to have a look at the work of the Kathrada Foundation, the institutes he mentioned there, Neshtara, the Gauteng City Region Observatory, and other initiatives that may spark interest for you. And so with that, I'm closing. There are recordings on the sessions that were here today. Tomorrow, there is still the continuation of the South African hub of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. So if you look on your screen there, tomorrow morning, there'll be a screening of one of the Good Hood stories and the small movies that they made, and a conversation with one of the activists that's featured in one of those Good Hood stories. And so that's tomorrow morning. And then there's an engagement at also in the morning at 9, lessons of innovation from the presidential employment stimulus, and really interesting and innovative work that's been done there. Also look out at the website of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival itself for other interesting and engaging topics, particularly if you're a civil servant and a student of ours, or a high flyer, or someone in industry or civil society. Those might spark off really creative ideas for what may be possible. And so from me, thank you so much. Thank you, Lerato. All the best to you. That's me signing out. Goodbye and God bless.